The porch lamp had not been lit in 3 years, and Clara Whitcomb no longer reached for the matchbox when evening came. She noticed the darkness the way she noticed the loose board by the pump, the crack under the kitchen door, and the second chair pushed too far beneath the table. Present, familiar, not worth speaking of. Folks in Calder Creek knew the little house at the bend in the road had once been a place where a man whistled while splitting wood and a woman set 2 plates out before supper. Now the shutters stayed latched against the wind. The rail fence leaned where winter had pressed it, and Clara moved through the rooms with the careful quiet of someone who had learned not to wake old memories. She was not helpless. That was the first thing anyone with eyes should have known. Before sunrise, she carried water from the pump, fed the hens, checked the flour tin, swept the kitchen, and set coffee to boil on the stove. Her hands were work hands, reddened at the knuckles in cold weather, steady with a needle, steady with a hoe, steady with anything that could be managed alone. What could not be managed alone, she had simply learned to walk around. The porch steps sagged on the left. She stepped on the right. The barn door dragged in wet weather. She lifted it with her shoulder. The roof above the feed room leaked in hard rain. She moved the grain sacks before storms and moved them back after. People called that getting by. Clara called it Tuesday. By noon, she had a basket of mending ready for Mrs. Pruitt in town, but she set it on the table and stood a moment with her palm resting on the cloth. The table still had the faint pale mark where her husband's cup used to sit. She had scrubbed it more than once in those first months, hard enough to leave her wrist aching, and the mark had stayed. After a while, she had stopped trying to erase it. Outside, a wagon passed on the road, wheels cutting through dry ruts, voices carrying and fading before they reached the house. Clara looked toward the window, but did not step closer. The world could pass by if it wanted. She had chores enough inside the fence. Near dusk, the wind shifted cold. Out of the north, bringing the smell of rain and tired horses. Clara took the wash from the line, folded it by the stove, and set 1 plate on the table. Then something struck the outer gate. Not hard, not wild, just once, like a hand too tired to knock again. She froze with the plate in her hand. The house listened with her. Clara set the plate down without sound and crossed to the door. She did not open it wide at first. 3 inches was enough to see the man standing beyond the porch rail with rain darkening the brim of his hat and 1 hand on the gatepost. His horse stood behind him, favoring its left foreleg, head low, breath showing white in the cold. The man looked past neither her shoulder nor the room behind her. He kept his eyes where they belonged. He said his name was Elias Mercer, and that his horse had gone lame near the South Wash. He asked if he might put the animal under her shed until morning. Not himself. The horse. Clara looked at the road, then at the sky, then at the animal lifting its sore foot out of the mud. She took her shawl from the peg and stepped outside. The gate hinge shrieked when she opened it. Elias noticed. He said nothing. Together they led the horse to the lean-to beside the barn, where Clara kept old feed buckets and a cracked trough she had meant to mend since spring. Elias removed the saddle carefully, checked the hoof by lantern light, and worked with the slow patience of a man who knew that frightened animals remembered rough hands. Clara stood back with the lantern. He did not ask her to come closer. He did not ask her to hold anything she had not offered. When the horse settled, Elias spread his coat over the rail to dry and turned toward the yard, ready to wait outside if that was all she allowed. Rain had begun in earnest by then, tapping hard on the shed roof and running from the brim of his hat. Clara looked toward the house. The stove was lit. The kitchen was warmer than the yard. She opened the door and pointed to the space near the hearth. He could sleep there until first light. Elias wiped his boots before stepping in. That small thing steadied her more than it should have. He set his wet hat on the floor beside the door instead of hanging it on the empty peg. Clara noticed that too. She gave him a folded quilt from the cedar chest and a tin cup of coffee gone strong from sitting. He took both with a nod and no performance of gratitude. Before lying down, he carried in the last of the porch wood without being asked, stacking it square beside the stove. Then he settled on the floor with his back to the wall, leaving the room and the silence to her. Clara woke before the light had fully reached the windows, certain the room would be empty. Men who passed through did not leave roots behind. They took warmth, took shelter, took the road again, and by morning a woman was left with the ashes to shake down and the cup to wash. She lay still a moment, listening for the hollow quiet she knew. Instead, She heard the stove ticking with fresh heat. She sat up slowly. The quilt she had given Elias was folded at the edge of the hearth, square and neat. The coffee pot had been moved closer to the fire. A small stack of split kindling sat where there had been only bark and splinters the night before. Clara rose and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Near the door, his hat was no longer on the floor. It hung from the empty peg. Not carelessly, not as if claiming the place. Just high enough to dry, brim turned outward, rainwater no longer dripping onto the boards. Clara stopped with one hand on the chair back. Outside, the yard lay silver with last night's rain, the ruts full, the barn roof shining dull under the gray morning. Elias was at the lean-to with his sleeves rolled to the forearms, one hand resting on the horse's neck while the other worked mud from the injured hoof. He had found the old hoof pick from the nail by the stall door. He had also set the cracked trough on 2 stones so it no longer tipped when filled. Clara watched through the window longer than she meant to. He moved like a man who knew the difference between helping and taking over. When she stepped outside, he looked up once, then went back to the horse. The animal should not travel today. He said it plain, more fact than request. Clara looked at the road, still wet and soft from the storm, then at the horse standing easier than it had the night before. She nodded toward the shed. One more day, then. Elias accepted it the way he accepted weather. No smile made too large. No thanks made too heavy. He only lifted the water bucket before she could reach it and filled the trough from the pump that always took both hands and half her patience. The handle stuck midway, as it always did. Elias felt the catch, studied the bolt, and said nothing. Clara noticed his eyes move to the loose hinge on the gate next. By breakfast, she had set out 2 cups without deciding to. By the 3rd morning, Clara had learned the sound of Elias working before breakfast. It was not a loud sound, a measured scrape of wood, the soft complaint of a hinge being lifted back into place. The pump handle moving once, stopping, then moving again after he had loosened the rusted bolt that had made it catch for 2 winters. Clara stood at the kitchen table with flour on her hands and listened without turning toward the window. The house had not sounded like that in a long while. Not busy, not crowded, just tended. Elias came in only when called, and not always then. He kept his hat on the peg by the door when he was inside and took it down whenever he crossed the threshold, as though even the smallest belonging needed permission to remain. That unsettled Clara more than rudeness would have. Rudeness, she understood. Careful respect gave her nothing firm to push against. She made biscuits that morning and set out molasses because the jar was nearly empty and there was no sense saving sweetness for a day that never came. Elias washed at the pump before coming in, dried his hands on his own handkerchief, and sat only after she sat. He ate like a man used to work, not waste. When he finished, he carried his plate to the basin and poured water over it before she could rise. Clara watched the steam lift from the tin. Nobody had done that in her kitchen in 3 years. After breakfast, he found the porch step. Not found it. Exactly. The step had announced itself beneath his boot, with the same tired dip it gave everyone. He crouched, pressed one hand to the board, and looked beneath it. Clara had a basket of beans to sort and every intention of ignoring him. 10 minutes later, he had pulled the old nails, cut a brace from scrap lumber stacked behind the barn, and set the board true. He did not ask why it had been left so long. That was the kindness of it. By noon, the gate opened without shrieking. By late afternoon, the draft under the kitchen door had been packed with a strip of old wool and nailed clean behind a narrow slat. Each repair was small enough to pretend it did not matter, and useful enough that Clara felt the difference the moment she moved through the house. She should have been grateful. Instead, she grew sharp around the edges. A woman could survive a broken step and a hard pump. She had proved that. What she did not know how to survive was someone noticing all the ways she had been making do. When Elias lifted the grain sacks away from the damp wall in the feed room, Clara stepped in too quickly and said she could manage her own place. He set the sack down at once. Not dropped. Set. Then he stepped back, giving the room to her. The silence that followed was plain and clean. Clara looked at the sack, then at the dry boards he had laid beneath the others without being asked. Outside, his horse shifted in the lean-to, still not ready for the road. Inside, the hat hung by the door, dark brim dry now, steady on the peg that had been empty for years. The next day settled into the house, without anyone naming it. Clara rose before dawn and found the stove already coaxed to life, not blazing, just warm enough to take the bite from the floorboards. Elias had left the ash bucket outside the door and brought in kindling split thin for morning use. His hat hung on the peg while he worked in the yard, and Clara found herself noticing it before she noticed the weather. She set coffee on, then paused with the second cup in her hand. After a moment, she placed it on the table across from hers. That was all. No declaration, no surrender, just a cup where there had not been one before. Elias came in after checking the horse and stopped only long enough to see the cup. Then he washed at the basin and sat. Clara had fried potatoes with onion and saved the last 2 eggs for the skillet. She told herself eggs spoiled if kept too long. Elias ate what was given and left the larger half of the potatoes in the pan without comment, the way a man leaves room for someone else without making kindness into a debt. Later that morning, Clara carried a basket of mending to Mrs. Pruitt's place and returned with flour, lamp oil, and a small paper twist of cinnamon she had not meant to buy. She saw it on the shelf, thought of the molasses jar, and set 2 pennies down before she could talk herself out of it. When she came home, Elias was behind the barn with Tommy Hale, the neighbor boy from the next quarter mile, showing him how to hold a rasp flat against a rough board. Tommy's mother took in washing and sent him over sometimes for eggs when she had coin enough. The boy was all elbows and patched knees, too quick to apologize for standing anywhere. Elias did not soften his voice into pity. He simply gave the boy a task sized for his hands. Clara stood by the gate and watched Tommy's shoulders settle as the board smoothed under his effort. That evening, she made corn cakes with a little cinnamon stirred into the batter. Tommy stayed long enough to carry in water and was invited to sit. Clara almost said there was not much, but stopped herself and set a 3rd plate instead. Elias moved the bench without being asked so the boy could reach the table easier. The meal was plain: beans, corn cakes, coffee for the adults, milk watered a little for Tommy. Still, the kitchen held a sound Clara had not heard in years: a chair leg scraping, a boy swallowing too fast, a man reaching for the butter crock and sliding it nearer to smaller hands first. After supper, Tommy fell asleep by the stove with the old farm cat against his boot. Elias carried the empty water bucket outside and filled it for morning. Clara washed 3 plates. 3. She set them in the rack and stood looking at them until the lamplight blurred along the tin edges. When Tommy woke, embarrassed and rubbing one eye, Elias gave him a wrapped corn cake for the walk home and walked him as far as the road where the ruts turned toward the Hale place. Clara watched from the doorway. The porch lamp remained unlit beside her hand. The hat was on the peg. The table was clean. The room was quiet again, but not empty in the same way. By the end of that week, Clara had begun to measure the mornings by more than chores. There was the stove taking flame before the room grew cold. There was the pump handle moving smooth in her palm. There was Tommy Hale stopping at the gate on his way back from delivering wash, trying not to look hopeful, and Elias finding some small work for him to do before Clara found some small food to send home in his pocket. None of it was grand enough for anyone to name. That made it harder to guard against. On Saturday, Clara went into Calder Creek with eggs, mending, and a list folded twice in her glove. Elias stayed behind to rest the horse another day and reset the feed room latch. Clara told herself that was sensible. The road was dry. The walk was only 1.5 miles. She had walked it alone plenty. At the general store, Mrs. Pruitt paid for the mending and spent too long smoothing the sleeve of a shirt that did not need smoothing. 2 women by the Cracker Barrel lowered their voices in the way people do when they want to be heard being careful. Clara kept her eyes on the sugar sack. Then Mrs. Alden said something about a man's hat hanging inside a widow's door, and the room went still enough for the stove to seem loud. Clara counted her coins wrong. She started again. Lydia behind the counter wrapped the lamp oil in paper without looking toward the women, but her jaw tightened once. Clara placed the coins down flat, picked up her parcels, and walked out before her face could do anything she would regret. The road home felt longer with every step. By the time she reached the fence, Tommy was on the porch shelling peas into a bowl, and Elias was kneeling by the door, fitting the feed room latch he had mended to a new screw. The sight should have steadied her. Instead, it struck the bruise the town had just pressed. A boy at her table, a man's tools by her door, a hat on her peg. Evidence, if people wanted it to be. Clara set the parcels inside and stood with her gloves still on. Tommy looked up, read the room without understanding it, and gathered the pea bowl close to his chest. Elias noticed him first. He told the boy his mother would be needing him before dark and handed him a small sack of eggs Clara had meant to pack later. Tommy left quietly. That kindness almost undid her. Clara waited until the boy was past the gate. Then she looked at Elias, not at his face but at the worn hat hanging behind him. She said the horse was sound enough now. The road would hold. Morning would be best. Elias held the screw between two fingers for a moment, then set it in the tin lid with the others. He nodded once. No argument. No wounded pride. He only finished tightening the latch so the door would close right after he was gone. Morning came clean and pale, with frost silvering the fence rails and the road lying firm beyond the gate. Elias was outside before Clara finished tying her apron, doing the last work a man does when he means not to leave trouble behind. He cleaned the ash from the stove, filled the wood box to the top, carried water until both buckets stood full on the bench, and checked the hinges on the barn door one more time. He moved quietly, as he always had, but the house seemed to hear every sound. Clara made breakfast because work came before feeling and because a person still needed feeding even on a leaving day. She set one plate at her place and one across from it. Her hand paused over the third plate Tommy had used. Then she left it in the cupboard. Not today. Not with the house already learning how to be empty again. Elias came in with his hat in his hand instead of placing it on the peg. The sight of that bare hook made the room colder than the weather had. He washed, ate what she served, and thanked her in the same plain way he had thanked her the first morning. Afterward, he carried his plate to the basin and washed it himself. Clara dried it and put it away. A small, foolish task. It felt like closing a door. By mid-morning, his saddle was on the porch rail, his bedroll tied, his horse standing sound enough beneath the shed. Elias walked the fence line once, not because it needed him, but because he had made a habit of making sure. Clara followed only as far as the porch. From there she saw the straightened gate, the repaired step, the pump handle resting easy, the feed room door latched tight against weather. None of those things were promises. They were boards, bolts, and work. That was why they mattered. A man could speak softly and leave nothing behind. Elias had spoken little and left the place better. Tommy came near noon with an empty egg sack and stopped at the gate when he saw the saddle. His face tried to be careful and failed. Elias crossed the yard, crouched beside the boy, and pressed a small pocket knife into his palm, the one he had used for shaving kindling. Clara could not hear what was said. She only saw Tommy nod hard and wipe his nose on his sleeve before running back toward the road. Elias stood until the boy was safely past the bend. Then he turned toward the porch. Clara stepped inside before he could see her face. She found herself at the table with both hands flat on the wood. 1 cup mark. 2 chairs. A cinnamon tin on the shelf. The porch lamp waiting cold by the door. She had told him to go because the town had looked at her and made her feel small. But the town had not fixed the pump. The town had not given Tommy work sized for his hands. The town had not left the bigger share of potatoes in the pan without a word. Outside, Elias lifted his hat. The empty peg waited. Clara reached for the porch lamp. Clara lit the porch lamp with hands that did not shake until the flame caught. It made a small gold circle against the late afternoon gray, weak at first, then steady behind the glass. She carried it to the window beside the door and set it where it could be seen from the road. Then she opened the door and stood on the porch with the cold moving through her sleeves. Elias had already led his horse past the gate. His bedroll was tied behind the saddle, his hat low against the wind. He had gone almost 30 yards when the light reached him. He stopped. Clara did not call out. Calling would have made it sound like fear, and this was not fear. She rested one hand on the porch post he had braced 2 days before and waited. Elias turned in the road. He looked at the lamp first, then at the house, then at Clara standing in the doorway of it. For a long moment, nothing moved except the horse lowering its head to nose at the dry grass near the ditch. Then a wagon came around the bend from town. Mrs. Alden sat beside her husband with a parcel in her lap, and Mrs. Pruitt rode in the back with a flour sack at her feet. Both women saw Elias in the road. Both women saw Clara at the door. Clara felt the old reflex rise in her, the need to step back, to close the door, to make herself smaller before anyone could speak. Elias did not move toward Clara. Not yet. He turned first to the wagon, took off his hat, and stood in the open road with the plain steadiness of a man who had nothing to hide and no shame to borrow. Mr. Alden slowed the team. No one said much. There was no speech to make of it. Elias only gave a respectful nod, then stepped aside so the wagon could pass. The women looked from him to Clara and found no flustered hurry, no guilty door closing, no man sneaking from a widow's yard. Just a lit lamp, a repaired gate, a woman standing straight, and a cowboy choosing not to leave her to face the road alone. When the wagon rolled on, Elias walked back through the gate. He tied his horse under the shed, unfastened the bedroll, and carried it to the porch. Clara stepped inside. He followed only as far as the threshold and waited there. After a moment, Clara reached past him, took the hat from his hand, and hung it on the empty peg. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of the pump moving smooth in the yard. For a moment, she stayed still, not bracing for emptiness, not counting what had been lost, only listening as water struck the bucket in a steady rhythm. The room held its ordinary shapes. The stove, the table, the porch lamp, now cold in the window, and by the door, Elias's hat hanging where she had placed it. Clara rose and made coffee. She took down 2 cups, then a third when she saw Tommy Hale crossing the road with his egg sack folded under one arm and that careful hope already on his face. Elias came in carrying water and set the bucket by the bench. He did not speak of staying. Clara did not speak of asking. Some things were stronger for being set gently into the day. She put corn cakes on the griddle and slid the molasses jar to the middle of the table. Tommy washed at the basin without being told. Elias moved the bench out for him. Clara set 3 plates down, one after another, and the sound of them against the wood filled the kitchen better than any speech could have. Outside, Calder Creek began its morning, wagons creaking toward town, smoke lifting from chimneys, hens complaining in the yard. Inside, the cat settled near Tommy's boot, the coffee steamed, and the repaired door held tight against the wind. Clara looked once at the pale cup mark still left on the table from another life. She did not cover it. She set Elias's cup beside it, close enough that both could belong to the same piece of wood. He noticed, because he noticed things. His hand paused on the chair back. Then he sat without making more of it than the moment could bear. After breakfast, Tommy carried scraps to the hens. Elias took up the axe for the morning wood. Clara stepped to the porch and lit the lamp, though the sun was already rising. This time it was not for the dark. It was for the road, for the boy, for the man in the yard, for the house that no longer needed to pretend it was empty. When Elias came back with an armload of split oak, Clara opened the door before he knocked.